We have followed Israel through a couple of stages up out of Egypt under Moses, in which case they were a nation, not just a group of tribes. But as they entered into the Promised Land, we see more of a kind of loosely allied tribal groups. And we don't have any nationalized king during that time. We have a couple that we saw that were almost kings. Remember, Gideon won his big battle against the Midianites, and they wanted to make him a king, and he refused. He had a son, Abimelech. Abimelech killed all of his brothers so that he could be the king, but even then he was just, kind of localized among his own people as a king. Then we get to Samuel, who is really the first leader that's got everybody congealed. They are one nation at times under God during Samuel's work. But as Samuel starts to get older, we still don't have a completely centralized government. We have a theocracy in the fact that Samuel on God's behalf is judging the people, but we don't have a national government like you and I might think of one. So in 1 Samuel 8 is where we first come into contact with the idea of nationalism among the Israelites. They want to be like everybody else. The nations around them were ruled by kings, and they thought that that was probably the best thing for them to do as a people, to finally have their place in Canaan was to have a king. So there's some spiritual things going on here. There's some political things going on. And of course, Samuel is right in the big middle of it. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel. The name of his second was Abijah. Both of these names, by the way, are pretty common, famous names in Israel. There's a prophet named Joel in the Old Testament. There's also a group, more than one, priests under the Old Testament system that were Abijah. So these are names that folks would have been used to. I don't know exactly what we would have in ours vernacular that's the same, but anyway, very common names. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. Does that sound familiar? Remember Eli? Eli, great leader. Hophni and Phinehas, not so much. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "You're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." I find this part of it kind of encouraging, discouraging at the same time. Samuel is so entrenched as the leadership that they come to him and they say, your sons are not any good. We don't want them to be our judge. We don't trust them. We don't think they're the right choice. But we want you to make the decision. You find us a king. We'll put you in charge because we trust you to find us a king. So at the same time, they're giving him a big compliment. We love the work that you've done. We really trust you with our nation. So replace yourself and give us somebody that we'll like better. So they said to him, "Give us a king to lead us." This displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to everything the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected. They have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are now doing to you. Listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." So you could almost name this section of Scripture, the more things change, the more they say the same. Eli, great leader, poor sons. Samuel, great leader, poor sons. Israel, they've been rejecting God all along the pathway ever since he brought them up out of Egypt. So Samuel, don't worry about it. It's not you. It's me that they're rejecting. What they have in Samuel is as close to a theocracy as you could get. Right? And a theocracy is a kingdom that is specifically led by the deity. So a priest in charge of the kingdom. Middle centuries England was almost a theocracy through the Catholic Church. Right? It was very church-led, church-oriented, church-governed. That's what they had in Israel. Things were as close to a God-led society as you could get. So when they said, we want a king, what they're saying is we need a human to be in charge of this. We don't want Samuel, who is God's representative, and in connection to that, we don't really want God to be our leader. We want to make our own decisions or have someone like us to make our decisions for us. I want us to look at Deuteronomy 17 real quick. On their way through the desert, God gave them a list of things that would be important for them when they decided they wanted a king. So this is not something that was, oops, God didn't know this was coming. This is something that God foresaw years in advance and has already told them what kinds of things are important if you're going to have a king. So Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning in verse 14. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled into it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the other nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. So we need to start with a God choice. They've come to Samuel. They trust Samuel as being God's man. So we're doing okay so far. Samuel, you choose one for us. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Don't place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. We're doing pretty good in that regard. During the time that Samuel was judging them, they were doing a pretty good job of following God, and they had gotten the Philistines kind of off their back. For a long time there, they were subject to the Philistines. Not necessarily the Philistine king was their king, but they were subject to the Philistines. And then verse 16, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. So God says, one of the things kings seem to like is lots of horses. So you don't want to have a king that has lots of horses. Now think about that and just meditate on it a little bit. What's wrong with collecting horses? I have some good friends who have some good horses. What's wrong with it? Well, it's not a pursuit of a king who wants to make sure that his kingdom's okay. It's a hobby for a king who wants to just have a lot of horses for his stables. Remind me in a minute not to forget to talk about Solomon. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a scroll or a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So here's the short version. When you find a king, he needs to be a Hebrew. He needs to have not too many horses and not too many wives and not too much money. And he needs to center the kingdom on the law to the point that he needs to have his own personal copy of the law that he keeps with him and that he reads regularly. So that's a good list, right? This is the kind of king that you want for yourself. Some kings were better than others at this, but when it comes to don't have too many horses, don't have too many wives, don't have too much money, that's pretty much Solomon in a nutshell. He was one of the wisest kings that Israel ever had, but he also made some tremendous mistakes because God gave him so much stuff. He was a collector of things, and he collected horses and wives, among other things. All right, well, here is the warning that God gives to them through Samuel. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. And still others will make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and his attendants. Your men servants and your maid servants and the best of your cattle and your donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When the day comes, you will cry out for relief from the Lord, or to the Lord from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. So just know in advance that this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a king, and he's going to take all your stuff, and he's going to take your kids, and he's going to center the kingdom around himself. And when that happens and you're miserable, don't think God's going to bail you out. If you want a king, you can have a king, but don't think God's going to bail you out. Verse 19, the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. We want to be like all the other nations. So the real reason behind this is not that Samuel's getting old or that his sons are not good leaders like he is. Those are just reasons that they're using. What they really want is nationalism. They want to be connected as 12 tribes, one nation, and have one centralized government because it seems to be working for the people around them. It seems like having one government makes more sense and that the people are doing better under that system than they were doing under the system of Samuel as judge and God as their ultimate king. They want a king, they said, to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles. Some kings were better at that than others. Solomon lived during a time of peace. During his kingdom, there wasn't much war. He was able to keep peace, at least partially, by marrying everybody's daughter. He was married to a whole bunch of the surrounding neighborhood kings' daughters, and that helped to keep the peace. But some were more warlike than others. David was more of a warrior before he became king, really, than after he became king, but all through his life he was a warrior. One of the reasons that God didn't want David to build the temple was that he was such a man of war. He had been so busy and bloodying his hands that God didn't want him to take care of building the temple. So verse 21, when Samuel heard all the things the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, everybody go back to your own town. So it's interesting to me that Samuel is the go-between, that there are conversations happening with the crowd that supposedly Samuel now needs to go report to God that God didn't hear what was going on over here. But Samuel keeps going back and forth. Go get a message from God, take it to the people. Get a message from the people, go check it out with God. He negotiates this thing between the people and God. And God says, give the people what you want. Or give the people what they want. And they are going to be surprised and disappointed at times. But from this point on, the disposition of Israel changes. Everything that they've been before is about to morph into what we think of when we think of the nation of Israel, the united, combined nation of Israel, through the reign of Saul, and David, and Solomon. And then, by then, things are coming apart at the seams, and it falls apart. But we'll take a look at that as we go through. Any questions about any of this? No? Okay. Well, we'll tell you guys bye. See you later. If there's anyone who has